The transatlantic relationship hangs by a thread, more fragile than ever before. President Donald Trump's recent pronouncements surpass anything previously said or done to Europe. With a single social media post, he not only dashed Ukraine's and Europe's hopes of continued American support in this conflict, but more horrifically, and I mean this for Kyiv and Brussels, America will align itself more closely with their adversary, Putin's Russia. Economically, the American leader unexpectedly threatened massive tariffs on its traditional allies. But why would the head of the United States adopt such an attitude? In the 2024 presidential election, Trump faced off against Democratic candidate Kamala Harris. At that time, most European leaders were reportedly backing Harris to become the 47th president of the United States. The German chancellor even publicly stated to the press that he knew Harris well and believed she would undoubtedly be a good president. The rare dissenter was Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. He suggested that Europe would need to reconsider its support for Ukraine if Donald Trump were elected. Specifically, we need to recognize that if there is a peace-supporting president and America pursues a path of peace, Europe cannot continue the hostilities as in Ukraine. Europe cannot shoulder the burden of war alone. Hungary has consistently been considered the black sheep of the EU. Recently, reports surfaced that Hungary would be stripped of its voting rights in the EU Council for repeatedly obstructing EU policy against Russia. This moment is no exception. Most European leaders disregarded the warnings, solely focused on supporting Harris. They didn't even bother to consider how to prepare if their preferred candidate faltered. And just like that, regardless of European preferences, the will of the American people is what decides who enters the White House. And swiftly, the repercussions arrived. On May 14, 2025, at the Munich Security Conference, Vice President JD Vance declared that the U.S. was no longer prepared to maintain a long-term presence in military conflict zones like the war in Ukraine if it didn't directly benefit America. This shocking statement revealed to Europe the true value of an American-style democracy, that they need to bear their own cross, to manage their own affairs instead of relying on unconditional support from the U.S. European leaders, from French President Emmanuel Macron to German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, were shocked and displeased. It's hardly surprising given the stark differences in foreign policy approaches between the Trump administration and its predecessors. While the Obama administration consistently emphasized its steadfast commitment to NATO and Europe, the Biden administration pledged strong support for Ukraine. The Trump administration, however, is making a complete U-turn in its approach to international affairs. European officials left Munich so shaken that they convened a high-level press conference to discuss the path forward. They had also just learned that the U.S. had planned negotiations with Russia in Saudi Arabia, but without the participation of any representatives from European allies or Ukraine. Subsequently, a more than 4-hour negotiation between U.S. and Russian officials took place, and Trump's reaction afterward utterly stunned Europe, and especially Ukraine. He blamed Ukraine for the conflict with Russia. 2 weeks later, a heated debate between President Donald Trump and Vice President JD Vance with President Volodymyr Zelensky continued to catch Europe off guard. European leaders were first shocked, then tried to appease Trump, then publicly planned to support Ukraine and defend themselves without the U.S. And then came the entire tragicomedy of the long-awaited, yet swiftly concluded negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Europe naively believed they and the U.S. had agreed on an ultimatum to Russia regarding the Ukraine conflict before Trump delivered a cold shower. Next, Trump spoke directly with President Putin. And what he said afterward to Europe and Ukraine was worse than anything he had ever said or done before. On social media, he wrote, "Russia wants to do great trade with the U.S. after this catastrophic conflict ends, and I am all for that idea. Russia has tremendous opportunity for jobs and wealth building. Their potential is unlimited. Ukraine can also be a major trading beneficiary as they rebuild their country. Jobs and prosperity predominantly of the American kind. But not just America. The words great trade and unlimited were capitalized in the original English text. Why were these words worse than anything Trump had ever said or done before? The issue isn't the current situation, nor is it the implication that many saw of the American president selling Ukraine to Putin in exchange for something very specific, measured in dollars. We are talking about far more significant issues. The leader of the world's most powerful nation has made a choice. While European countries are truly asserting their position in the world and building their future by leaning on Russia. Don't misunderstand. I don't mean through pragmatic cooperation, but through fighting against Russia. The closer these nations are to Russia's border, the more actively anti-Russian they are, dreaming of how they will divide Russia's spoils after a common victory over the Russians. They believe Russia is a giant with feet of clay, capable of being subdued and broken, and all Europe needs is more resolve. However, anyone rational and clear-headed must recognize that Russia is a powerful and self-reliant global force. It needs to be treated with respect, without interference, and good neighborly relations need to be developed. Ukraine's history has shown that subduing Russia is unrealistic, and Trump has decided to approach Russia's wealth in the opposite way. He recognizes the Russians as worthy adversaries, builds an equal relationship with Moscow, and tries to reach agreements without hiding his goal of making a lot of money. Previously, President Trump considered imposing sanctions on Russia, including secondary sanctions on countries buying Russian oil like India and China. However, this scenario could lead to escalating trade tensions between the U.S. and other nations. This might concern Trump, especially as the U.S. is negotiating with countries to de-escalate the tariff war. If President Trump were to impose even harsher sanctions on Russia, it would drag the U.S. deeper into a war with no foreseeable end. Therefore, President Trump was forced to make the wisest choice with the motto, "America first," and seek every advantage for the United States. Trump sees no benefit in long-term investment in conflict with Russia, an adversary with whom Trump wants to maintain a mutually beneficial relationship. For President Trump, the phone call with President Putin ignited hope for a bright future of large-scale trade relations between Russia and the U.S. once this conflict concludes. A foreign policy advisor to the Russian president stated that the atmosphere of the Trump-Putin call was so close that neither president wanted to be the first to hang up. Meanwhile, with Europe and Ukraine, he made no effort to conceal his indifference. Before calling Putin, Trump had a fleeting conversation with Zelensky. President Zelensky told Trump not to make decisions about Ukraine without Kyiv. But instead of delivering a clear ultimatum to Putin about accepting a ceasefire, Trump seemed solely focused on a future relationship with Putin. Before informing Zelensky and European allies that the war in Ukraine was now a problem they alone had to solve. A president who once promised to end the conflict on day one of his second term now appears to be withdrawing from this effort and leaving Ukraine to decide its own fate. The Trump-Putin call confirmed Europe's greatest fear, that the American president was ready to pivot to Moscow and ignore Kyiv. Not only on the issue of Ukraine, the American president also pressured Europe on trade and tariffs. On social media, he declared VAT and ridiculous corporate penalties, non-monetary trade barriers, currency manipulation, and many unfair lawsuits against U.S. companies in the EU market are major reasons for the US's $250 million annual deficit. He criticized the EU for deadlocking tariff negotiations. Then he proposed immediately imposing a reciprocal 50% tariff on goods imported from the EU starting June 1st. Do all these moves indicate that for Trump, Europe is merely a freeloading parasite? Or in other words, Europe is exploiting America's generosity without full reciprocation? It's just like when Trump complained that Europe wasn't spending enough on defense because they were sure the US would swoop in to save them. But Trump won't do that. The proof is when he said, Ukraine and Europe are closer to Russia, so they should handle this war themselves. It has nothing to do with the US. The same applies to trade. Trump views the deficit between the US and the EU as evidence that Ukraine is taking advantage of the American economy, relying on the immense purchasing power of American consumers to sell a lot of goods but refusing to buy American products. Of course, this doesn't mean all of Trump's views are correct, mind you. Take America's enormous military spending, for instance. American politicians don't vote to spend tons of money on defense simply out of concern for European security. More importantly, it's to maintain the world's most powerful military to protect America's global hegemony. However, Trump has made a choice. The US is gradually shifting towards a multipolar strategy. But in that world, where powers like China and Russia are asserting a greater role in global affairs, Europe seeking an independent role in the current global order is almost impossible. Europe has been too dependent on the US for decades, and this shift isn't merely a strategic choice, but a struggle with the very values and interests they have long embraced. A big question arises. Does Europe have enough strength and unity to stand on its own? If Europe is truly serious about becoming an independent counterweight, they will have to accept significant risks. A breakdown in relations with the US could not only weaken European security, but also create irreversible opportunities for other powers. In a transition to a multipolar world, are the world and its nations truly ready for these monumental shifts in human history? Will this change bring a new and better world order? Perhaps only time will answer this question. If you found this content helpful, please hit like and subscribe to give me more motivation to create more videos. Thank you so much, everyone.